The poor waitress was humiliated in the middle of the restaurant, but minutes later, she saved the life of the millionaire's deaf mother with an unexpected act. From that moment, the entire restaurant fell silent, and the secret of her true identity began to unravel. You won't believe what she did. Watch until the end to understand why a simple action made the millionaire drop silently to his knees. Table 9. The Everett Group. Hurry up, Sophie. The manager's voice was crisp, cutting through the noise of a Friday night at Le Ciel restaurant. Sophie Campbell shivered slightly. She tried to maintain a tidy appearance, even though her uniform dress was old, and she always felt her timidness was ill-suited to the fast pace of the restaurant. The manager added a final hushed warning. That's Ethan Everett, the big boss's son, demanding. And remember, his mother is deaf. Don't do anything stupid. The name Everett hit Sophie hard. She froze. It was a name that had been buried, an old wound just reopened. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain a professional demeanor, and carried the menu tray toward table 9. The restaurant door opened, and Ethan Everett walked in. He was tall, his appearance cold and authoritative in his dark suit. He focused his attention entirely on the woman beside him, Mrs. Catherine Everett, elegant, with neatly tied hair and bright eyes. Ethan checked the table with a cold gaze, then spoke briefly to the manager. She is my mother, not my wife. The statement was an assertion of control and protection. Sophie quietly approached, bowing. Mrs. Catherine smiled, but Ethan did not. He held a glass of red wine, swirling it gently before raising it to his nose. 18 degrees, Ethan said, his voice deep but firm. Not 20. Sophie felt her heart constrict. She stepped forward to replace the glass. Her hand trembled. A drop of dark red wine spilled over the rim, quickly soaking into the pristine white tablecloth. Ethan tightened his jaw. Mrs. Catherine gently placed her hand on her son's arm, signaling, "Don't be upset." Ethan gripped the wineglass for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. But he did not remain silent. Ethan took a fresh napkin from the side and slowly wiped the spilled wine, even though it had already soaked into the cloth. He looked at Sophie, his gaze penetrating her fear and confusion. "This lack of precision," Ethan said, his voice deep and slow, emphasizing every word, "will cost a significant amount in dry cleaning. But I suppose you aren't familiar with these standards, are you?" He placed the soiled napkin on the table, almost throwing it down. "Just do your job well, and don't let your hand shake with anxiety when handling something of value. We are here to eat, not to watch a disaster rehearsal." Sophie felt the blood rush to her face. The humiliation made her want to run immediately. She swallowed hard, bowing her head deeper, not daring to look directly into those cold eyes. She stood silently, waiting for the main course to be served. When the grilled cod was placed down, Sophie breathed a sigh of relief. Just a few more seconds. But just as she turned away, Mrs. Catherine suddenly stiffened. She placed a hand on her chest, her breath coming in gasps, her face rapidly turning pale. She tried to communicate something, her hands moving frantically in the air, but only creating panic. Ethan jumped up in alarm. "Mother! What is it? Someone call a doctor." From the counter, Sophie saw those hand movements. It wasn't a heart attack. They were basic signs, chaotic due to fear. She acted immediately. She put down her serving tray and quickly approached the table without asking permission. "Excuse me," Sophie said, then sat down in the empty chair beside Mrs. Catherine, taking hold of her panicked hand. Ethan spun around, his face dark with anger and fear. "Who are you? Get out!" Sophie ignored him. She signed quickly and clearly. "Are you choking?" "Not your heart." "Calm down, breathe." Mrs. Catherine nodded hard, tears streaming down her face from the choking. Sophie grabbed a napkin, helped her drink small sips of water, and then gently pressed on her back. She coughed softly and began to breathe. Ethan remained standing there, completely immobile. His eyes were fixed on the hands of his mother and Sophie, hands that had just communicated amidst the chaos, using a language he, the heir of the Everett Corporation, completely failed to understand. Mrs. Catherine reached out and squeezed her hand tightly. She looked deep into Sophie's eyes and signed, "Thank you. You are the only one who understood me." Sophie offered a soft smile, signing back, "You're welcome, madam. Your well-being is all that matters." When the restaurant's medical staff arrived, Ethan turned to Sophie, his voice low and cold, mixed with scrutiny. "Where did you learn sign language?" Sophie answered softly, looking down. "I learned it from my mother. She is also deaf." Ethan frowned. The coldness returned, but now it was mixed with a dangerous curiosity. "Few people here understand my mother." "You pique my interest." Mrs. Catherine held her hand tightly. "I hope to see you again soon." Sophie bowed her head and left the table. The light shone on the small brass nameplate on her uniform. Sophie Campbell. Ethan watched her shadow disappear. He read the nameplate aloud, gripping the empty wine glass in his hand. Campbell. What a coincidence. He knew that name, and he never believed in chance. The morning in Manhattan was hazy. Faint sunlight filtered through the car window, illuminating Ethan Everett's sleep-deprived face. He sat in the black sedan parked outside the office building, his coffee cooling in his hand. But his mind wasn't on the meetings that awaited him. Since last night, the image of Sophie Campbell's hands, small yet steady, signing to his mother amid the panic, kept haunting him. That language, silent yet powerful, had saved his mother, and it had made him, a man who always believed he could control everything, suddenly feel small. Ethan opened his phone. In the personnel list of Le Ciel restaurant, he paused inadvertently at the line. Sophie Campbell, part-time server. The surname made him freeze. Campbell. That name brought back a memory he thought he had forgotten. An old project, a name that once made his father furious just to hear it. He planned to turn it off, but his finger touched the screen instead. A simple operation, not a command, just curiosity. He opened her file. Age 27, formerly studied civil engineering at the National University, dropped out in the 3rd year. He frowned. A girl with an education who had stepped into a difficult engineering field was now serving tables in a fancy restaurant. Something was wrong. Ethan leaned back in his seat, silent for a few seconds. He didn't want to dig deeper, not out of morality, but out of a vague feeling of guilt. His mother once said, "Don't judge people quickly by a small mistake. Only those who understand silence truly know how to love, Ethan." He smiled faintly, wondering why he only remembered that now. Perhaps because last night he had seen someone who truly understood silence. Meanwhile, Sophie Campbell was riding her old bicycle along the suburban road. The morning breeze carried the scent of coffee and the sound of bread vendors. She had barely slept last night. The image of the gentle woman, Mrs. Catherine, still appeared in her mind like a warm dream amidst a cold life. She felt proud that she had helped the woman, but also afraid. The name Everett, the name she wanted most to forget, had returned. She recalled the gaze of the young man sitting next to Mrs. Catherine. Cold, but when he saw his mother breathing, that look flared. A transient moment of humanity she hadn't expected. Sophie arrived at her small rented room. Peeling walls, a chipped wooden table, and an old picture frame with her parents' photo. She put down her bag and looked at the photo for a long time. In the picture, her mother was smiling. the deaf woman who always taught her that, when words cannot reach, use your hands to speak from the heart. She gently traced her finger across the glass frame. "Mother, I used your language again. I don't know whether to be happy or scared." She sat silently for hours, troubled. She should have quit. Working at that restaurant, where the name Everett was mentioned, only brought back painful memories. She opened her phone, typing a draft message to the manager. "I request to take tonight off. I may quit entirely next week." But before she could send it, the phone vibrated. A new message arrived from the same person. "Sophie, Mr. Everett requests that you serve a private lunch today." At the mansion. She froze. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, shining directly onto the photo of her father on the table, the man who had lost everything because of the Everett Corporation. Her heart pounded. No way. What does he want from me? In his office, Ethan was looking out the large window. The city below was filled with movement, but he only felt a strange emptiness. He intended to forget about last night, but when he saw his mother texting someone, a rare smile flickering on her lips, he couldn't bear it. "What are you thinking, Ethan?" Mrs. Catherine's voice was light as the wind, her hand resting on her son's shoulder. "I'm just wondering about the server last night," he replied softly. "She understood your signs." "During the panic, I understood nothing." Mrs. Catherine smiled gently. "That language is a bridge of patience. You cannot learn it if you're only curious." Ethan was silent. He realized she was right. But deep inside, what he felt wasn't just curiosity, but an unexplainable urge. He wanted to see her again, to understand why, in just a few short minutes, that girl made his entire world, a world built on logic and control, suddenly feel warmer. He didn't give an order to anyone. He just spoke softly to the restaurant manager, as if wanting to verify something. "Tomorrow, arrange for a private lunch server for my mother. Keep the same girl, Sophie Campbell." In the afternoon, Sophie sat in her room, still hadn't replied to the message. She looked out the window, the dry trees swaying gently in the wind. Inside her, fear and curiosity wrestled like two sides of the same mirror. She thought of Mrs. Catherine's eyes, her trembling hands seeking help, and Ethan's surprised gaze. Perhaps he wasn't the ruthless man rumored. Perhaps he was just a man who had forgotten how to listen. She picked up her phone and typed a short line. "I will come." Then she put it down, gently closing her eyes. In her fitful sleep, she heard her mother's voice from years ago. Some people only understand the hearts of others when the world around them is silent. And the next morning, when the luxurious car of the Everett Group stopped in front of the small rented room, Sophie knew. Destiny had knocked. No noise. No warning. Just a silent signal that she was forced to heed. But Sophie did not know that, on the other side of the city, Ethan was also looking at an old photo of his father, and in that frame, there was someone with the surname Campbell. Chapter 3. The Insincere Invitation. The taxi carrying Sophie to the Everett mansion stopped before the intricately carved iron gates. The atmosphere here was completely different from the bustle of Lyciel. This place was silent and distant, as if the outside world did not exist. The butler, Thomas, led Sophie into the private dining room. The light was dim, the air cold, as if they were in a boardroom, not a lunch setting. Ethan Everett was already waiting. He sat at the end of the table, not looking directly at her, but reading documents. "Sit down," Ethan said, his voice dry without looking up. "I don't like talking to people who have to look up at me." Sophie remained silent, pulling out a chair and sitting on the edge of the seat opposite him. She tried to keep her back straight, hiding the trembling inside. She knew this was not an ordinary lunch, but an interrogation. Ethan folded the documents, looking straight at her. His gaze no longer held annoyance, but calculation. "Campbell," he said, emphasizing the name. "You studied engineering, attended the National University, perhaps destined for a much better future than the job you have now. Why did you drop out? And why are you here?" Sophie clenched her hands. She knew this was what he wanted to find out. "I have my own reasons, sir, and the job at Le Ciel pays my rent. You could find another job, such as an office position, or working part-time somewhere with less risk of spilling red wine." Ethan smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I don't believe you are only here for the money. What is your motive for intentionally approaching my mother?" "I did not intentionally approach her," Sophie replied, her voice trembling slightly from the false accusation. "I was just doing my job. She had a problem, and I helped. You helped, and coincidentally, you were the only one who understood her. Too perfect a coincidence for me." Ethan placed both hands on the table. "I need a private interpreter for my mother, someone who can assist her in meetings and personal life. I will pay you 3 times your current salary." Sophie was surprised. This was something she hadn't expected. She looked at him, then down at the table. "I refuse, sir," she replied. Ethan raised an eyebrow, seemingly taken aback. He rested his elbow on the table, propping up his chin, looking at her as if she had just revealed an ancient mathematical formula. "Why?" "You have a good opportunity here. Triple the salary. No more running tables." Sophie took a breath. She knew she had to say this if she didn't want to be drawn into the Everett family's vortex. "I apologize, but that job would require me to interact with you frequently." Ethan raised both eyebrows. And I do not like the way you look at me, sir," Sophie said bluntly, although her heart was pounding like a drum. "I don't like how you judge others, and I certainly don't appreciate the sarcasm regarding my ability to pay for dry cleaning. I cannot work in an environment where I feel humiliated every time I spill a drop of wine. I would rather spill wine at Le Ciel than spill it under your gaze." The room fell silent. Ethan stared at her, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan Everett burst out laughing. It was a hearty laugh, echoing in the private dining room, startling Sophie. She had prepared for anger, for coldness, but not for this laughter. "Fascinating," Ethan said, trying to suppress his laughter, but his shoulders still shook. "You are the first person, in 10 years of running the Everett Group, to tell me straight that she doesn't like the way I look at her. You have guts, Campbell." He regained his composure, although the corner of his mouth still curved slightly. "All right. So you would rather continue a precarious job, living in the suburbs, as long as you don't have to endure my presence?" "That's right, sir," Sophie replied simply. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking at her as if analyzing a rare artifact. He knew he couldn't force her with money or power if she had so directly refused. But he couldn't let her go. He needed to keep her here, close to his mother, and close to his control. Just then, Mrs. Catherine entered the room. She wore a soft wool dress, a gentle smile on her face. She noticed the strained but peculiar atmosphere between the two. She sat down next to her son, signing to Sophie. "Has my son been difficult with you?" Sophie smiled, signing back. "No, madam. Mr. Everett was just making a job offer, and I refused." Mrs. Catherine turned to Ethan, signing with a serious expression. "You should be less harsh. I need her." Ethan sighed, looking at his mother, then at Sophie. He respected his mother's decision, and he knew he had to find another way to keep her. The lunch ended in constructive silence. Sophie packed her things, bowing to Mrs. Catherine with a sign. The woman held her hand. her face showing regret. Sophie walked out of the room, her shoulders relaxing. She had passed the test. She just wanted to quickly leave this luxurious mansion. She had only taken a few steps down the empty corridor when Ethan's voice rang out from behind her, cold and decisive. "Sophie Campbell." She stopped and turned her head. Ethan stepped closer, holding his phone. His gaze now carried no humiliation, but a direct threat. "Before you decide to refuse this opportunity again," he said, his voice so low that it was only audible to the two of them, "I think you should consider that you are the daughter of Robert Campbell. He used to work for my father." Sophie was stunned. Her entire blood pressure seemed to drop. She flinched, looking straight into Ethan's eyes, her face pale. Her secret had been discovered. Ethan Everett wasn't just curious about her, he'd investigated her. In that moment, memories of Robert Campbell and the Everett Group flooded back, connecting the two of them with a dangerous thread. Sophie's horrified gaze met Ethan's sharp eyes, a subconscious question appearing in her mind. Could he be? The door of the Everett mansion closed behind Sophie Campbell with a heavy sound, as if the past and present had just collided in that moment. She quickly walked out onto the stone path, the midday sun glinting on the wet pavement, her heart pounding like the sound of a taxi wheel rolling on hot asphalt. She sank into the back seat, holding her handbag tightly. Her face reflected in the window, pale, tense, and mixed with a hint of fear. Ethan Everett. That name was now not just the image of the cold man in the black suit, but the living memory of a tragedy she had been running from for years. She tried to take a long breath, looking outside. The city receded, while in her mind, fragments of memory rushed back. Henry Everett, Ethan's father, who was once a symbol of power in the energy industry, was also the one who signed the indictment that branded Robert Campbell, her father, as an embezzler. They had ruined her father, and now his son was trying to control her. She clenched her hand. Her fingers were cold. The old resentment had never faded. She had just hidden it under the dust of time. Back in her small rented apartment in the suburbs, Sophie threw her uniform onto a chair, then sat heavily on the floor, letting out a sigh. The room was quiet, with only the ticking of the wall clock. She opened her laptop, typing her father's name into the search bar. Robert Campbell, Everett Group, 2009. The screen displayed an old article, the headline cold, "Chief Engineer of Solaris Project, accused of embezzlement, fled before hearing." She opened the attached photo. Her father, with tired eyes, stood between Henry Everett and Lucas Chen, the then vice president. His face looked like someone enduring an unpronounced sentence. She zoomed in, touching the screen, trembling. "Father." "I know you didn't do it." Tears streamed out. She stood up, walking to the small altar in the corner of the room. Her mother's portrait was placed next to her father's photo. The old candle was out, the incense smoke faint. Sophie knelt, her voice hoarse. "Mother." "I can't keep hiding anymore. I have to go back to where they buried father." She cried, but this time, not out of fear. It was because she knew the road ahead would be full of pain, but she couldn't let her father's injustice be forgotten forever. At the same time, on the other side of the city, Ethan Everett sat silently in his 48th floor office. The vast room had transparent glass walls, overlooking the entire city, but he saw nothing but an empty space in his mind. Since Sophie left, his mood had been troubled. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, proud but not arrogant, vulnerable but unyielding. The name Campbell made him uneasy. It was like a key opening a door he had never dared to touch. He pressed the intercom button. "Thomas, I need you for a moment." Thomas, the Everett family's loyal old secretary for 30 years, walked in, holding a stack of old files. His face was somber, his eyes holding the look of someone who knew more than they were allowed to say. Ethan turned his chair around, his voice husky. "Do you remember the Robert Campbell case?" Thomas paused briefly. "Sir, that matter was closed years ago. Mr. Henry doesn't like to mention it. But I want to know the truth." Ethan clasped his hands together. "I've reviewed the digitized file. It was closed hastily, with insufficient evidence. You were a witness to all the reports at that time. Tell me the truth." Thomas looked at him for a long time, then lowered his voice. "Mr. Robert Campbell was not a bad person. He was a talented, devoted engineer. But something was wrong. Several suspicious money transfers appeared in the Solaris project. When Mr. Robert discovered it, he reported it to Mr. Henry." Ethan frowned. "And then Mr. Lucas Chen intervened. A week later, the embezzlement accusation was announced, but no one was allowed to see the original copy of the evidence." Thomas paused, his voice faltering. "I kept a copy of the accounting minutes, but Mr. Henry demanded I hand over everything. I only remember that money never entered Robert Campbell's account." A heavy atmosphere enveloped the room. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his hand trembling slightly. "Thank you, Thomas. That's all I need to start." The old secretary bowed slightly. Before stepping out, he only whispered, "Mr. Henry did everything for reputation. But reputation cannot hide the shadow of the truth, Mr. Ethan." The door closed. Ethan sat alone, looking out at the city lighting up. Inside him, a conflict arose, between loyalty to his father and the responsibility of the Everett Group heir. He knew that by digging deeper into the Campbell case, he would touch upon the forbidden territory of his family. He touched the desktop, where the light reflected his face, cold and tired. "Perhaps she wasn't wrong," he murmured. "Perhaps we are the ones who owe the debt." In the suburban rented room, Sophie sat in front of her laptop, staring at the screen. A new message arrived from an unknown number. "Interpreter contract. Starts tomorrow. Address and details attached." She looked at the text for a long time. E.E. 2 short characters, but enough to make her shiver. She stood up, walking to the window. The city outside was luxurious, brightly lit, like a world she didn't belong to. But she knew, to reclaim justice, she had to step into it. She picked up her phone, opened the old message, and deleted the line, "I refuse," that she had drafted. Her hand trembled slightly. Taking a deep breath, she typed again, "I agree. See you tomorrow." She put the phone down, then turned back to the altar, clasping her hands. "Father, I will return. Not for revenge, but for you to find peace." The candle on the table flickered gently in the wind, brightened, and went out. At the Everett mansion, Ethan was still sitting in his study. The screen in front of him displayed old financial reports, soulless but haunting numbers. Outside, the sky darkened, rain drizzling on the glass. He turned on the desk lamp, but it couldn't dispel the darkness spreading in his heart. On the desk, the phone vibrated softly. The message arrived. "I agree." He read it slowly, then gently leaned back in his chair. A faint smile appeared, not of arrogance, but of the conflict between triumph and guilt. He stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the city lights reflected in his eyes, cold and lonely. "You will return, Sophie Campbell," he whispered, his voice mixed with warning and an indescribable ache. "And perhaps neither of us will have a way back." The next morning, the luxurious car of the Everett Group stopped in front of the small suburban room. Sophie stepped out, holding only an old handbag. She looked along the long road leading toward the city, where secrets, guilt, and justice awaited. On the other side, Ethan stood by his office window, watching the traffic flow. At the same time, Sophie sat in the car, clutching the contract in her hand. 2 people, 2 pains, signing a destiny they didn't know where it would lead them. And outside, the morning light shone on the glass, then faded. A new chapter began, where truth and lies were separated by a single breath. Sophie Campbell did not feel the relief she expected on her first day working at the Everett mansion. The atmosphere here carried a sense of luxurious stillness, so much so that every step she took on the marble floor seemed to echo between memory and present. She knew she hadn't come here merely as an interpreter, but to find the truth buried under the Everett name. But that didn't make her any less tense. When the old butler Thomas led her down to the kitchen, the scent of roasted coffee and melting butter filled the air. Sophie carefully took out her notebook and a pencil, beginning to take notes. The head chef, a tall Frenchman, raised an eyebrow at her. "Ms. Campbell, you are an interpreter, not a sous chef. I've never seen anyone start work by asking for recipes." Sophie smiled faintly, her voice small but firm. "I know. But the way a person eats is also the way they communicate. I need to understand Mrs. Catherine's habits and Mr. Ethan's. Sometimes what they don't say is the most important thing." The chef laughed, stirring a pot of porridge as he spoke. "Mr. Ethan is different. He doesn't talk, doesn't smile, and almost no one understands him. He drinks Americano, hand-poured, no milk, no sugar. The water must stop at 92 degrees Celsius. If it's even slightly over, he'll frown, as if he just bit into a lemon peel." Sophie diligently wrote down, "Coffee, 92 degrees Celsius. When annoyed, frowns, like lemon." She smiled, a faint but genuine smile. The first time she felt that, amidst all this luxury and coldness, there was still something human. The large dining room, early morning. Mrs. Catherine Everett was teaching Sophie how to sign her name, her hands moving gracefully as if dancing. Sophie watched attentively, repeating the gesture with respect. Mrs. Catherine chuckled softly, a smile that brightened the entire room. Ethan stood at the doorway, quietly observing. That silent laughter made him momentarily stunned. It had been a long time since he had seen his mother so happy. When Sophie noticed him, she stood up, adjusted her uniform, her voice gentle. "Good morning, Mr. Everett." Ethan walked to the table, his gaze maintaining its usual calm reserve. "I thought you only worked in the afternoon." Mrs. Catherine quickly signed. "She woke up early to cook for me. She is very thoughtful." Ethan looked at the steaming bowl of oatmeal in surprise. It was a simple dish, but rarely did it suit his mother's palate so well. Sophie bowed her head, opening her notebook. "I want to ensure no wine spill incidents occur again. Therefore, I need to know your eating habits to avoid similar situations." Ethan leaned his hands on the table, his voice still dry. "You can send an email. I don't have time for psychological surveys." Sophie smiled faintly, not backing down. "There isn't time, sir. I want to ask right now." She paused, then spoke softly, her voice slow, almost a whisper. "I want to know, when you're tired, what soothes your heart?" The question caused the atmosphere to settle. Ethan frowned slightly, but not out of annoyance. He was not used to anyone touching the small corners of his soul. "Do you think I need something to soothe my heart?" he asked, half smiling, half coldly. "Not everyone needs it," Sophie replied. "But sometimes, even a cup of tea at the right temperature can make a long day more pleasant." Mrs. Catherine smiled, placing her hand on her son's arm, signing, "You used to brew jasmine tea for me every morning. Warm enough. You said the scent helped me sleep better." Ethan fell silent. He didn't remember doing that, but his mother did. The entire room was quiet, only the sound of a spoon gently stirring in the porcelain bowl. He spoke softly, almost to avoid Sophie's gaze. "Do your work, Campbell. I don't like owing anyone, Sophie replied, her voice small but clear. Understood. I don't need thanks. Just make sure you eat enough breakfast to have the strength to work. Mrs. Catherine laughed, and Ethan, despite trying to maintain his cold demeanor, the corner of his mouth curved slightly, a faint but genuine smile. In the afternoon, Sophie rearranged the antique library in the mansion. The bookshelves were towering, dusty, and the light filtered through the hazy glass windows. She traced the spine of each book, noting down a few signs Mrs. Catherine asked her to teach. Ethan walked in, his shirt sleeves rolled up, holding a thick file. She looked up. Their eyes met. Campbell, he said, his voice deep, if your father was innocent, why did he leave? The air seemed to thicken. Sophie stopped her hand mid-air. She put the book down, looking straight at him. He didn't leave, she said slowly. He died of illness before he was cleared. He fought alone, accused by people with more power than him. Ethan was silent. For the first time, his gaze didn't hold judgment, but a bit of confusion mixed with sorrow. Sophie took a step forward, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Everett, have you ever considered that power can also be wrong? That sometimes, to preserve reputation, people are willing to bury the truth? He looked at her for a long time, as if wanting to say something, then gently shook his head. You don't know my father, he said, his voice slightly choked. He did everything for the honor of this family. And my father also lived for his honor, Sophie replied. But the honor of the poor has no one to protect it. Ethan gripped the file tightly, then left without saying another word. The door closed softly. Late evening. Sophie tidied the living room, rearranging the tea set on Mrs. Catherine's table. The light cast a long shadow of her onto the wooden floor. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw Ethan standing outside in the garden. It was drizzling. He didn't carry an umbrella. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking up at his mother's window, where a weak yellow light shone out. His face was blurred in the rain, somber and lonely. Sophie stopped. She took the umbrella hanging by the door, walked out onto the porch, and stopped at the threshold. A cold gust of wind swept by, carrying the scent of damp earth. She gripped the handle of the umbrella, intending to approach, but then paused. She didn't want him to see her, because perhaps that man didn't need anyone to shield him from the rain, but needed to learn how to open his heart to the first rain after years of being frozen. Sophie stood there for a long time, silently watching his shadow in the rain, her hand tightly gripping the unopened umbrella. She whispered softly, just enough for the wind to hear, "Maybe you're not cold from the rain, but from loneliness." A flash of lightning reflected the figures of two people, one inside, one on the porch, standing in two different worlds, but both quietly seeking warmth. Inside, Mrs. Catherine quietly pulled the curtain, looking down at her son and the young woman. She smiled, signing gently to herself. Finally, this house has laughter and a beating heart. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady, gentle like the rhythm of a day that was slowly changing. And amidst the sound of the rain, a small crack had formed in Ethan Everett's thick layer of ice. No one realized it, but through that crack, a little light was softly creeping in. The next morning, the night rain had stopped, but the atmosphere in the mansion still carried an invisible tension. Sophie began her day by helping Mrs. Catherine practice lip reading. The woman pointed to an old book. "Read it to me, Sophie." Read it loud and clear, so my son knows I'm making progress. Sophie smiled, beginning to read, "Time waits for no one, but sometimes waiting is the only way to understand its value." When she finished, Ethan walked in. He said nothing, just poured a cup of coffee, carefully measured, not exceeding 92 degrees Celsius. and sat down. His gaze lingered on Sophie longer than necessary, but quickly turned away. Her words from last night, about loneliness and the truth about her father, were haunting him. He knew he had entered a dangerous game with this girl. That evening, the Everett mansion hosted a small party for important business partners. Sophie was assigned to serve Mrs. Catherine privately in a small lounge area, away from the main noise. Ethan wore a tuxedo. He completely dominated the crowd. He was talking to Lucas Chen, the corporation's vice president, the man Sophie had seen in the old photograph. Lucas Chen was outwardly polite, but his eyes were sharp and glanced at Sophie with cold assessment. He shook Ethan's hand. "I heard you have a new interpreter." "A sign language speaking waitress. A peculiar choice." Ethan took a sip of wine. "I need someone who understands my mother." Lucas smiled faintly, leaning close to Ethan. "Or do you need someone to make you feel less guilty?" "You know well, Ethan. Your father signed Campbell's dismissal order." "She carries that name? Right here in your house." "Not a smart move." Ethan tightened his grip on his wine glass. This statement struck directly at what he was trying to avoid: the conflict between loyalty to his father and the growing suspicion. Meanwhile, Mrs. Catherine began to feel tired. Sophie helped her through the quiet hallway to her room. Just as they passed the service area, a server accidentally tripped, spilling a tray of wine. Glasses shattered loudly, the noise terrifying. Mrs. Catherine flinched violently. She clutched her head, her hands trembling, panicked signs spreading in the air. Everyone around was confused. Sophie reacted in a flash. She covered the woman's ears, gently pulled her into an embrace, and signed reassuringly, "It's all right, madam. Just broken glass. No danger. I'm here." Mrs. Catherine looked at her, her breathing gradually steadying. A few seconds later, she was calm again. Ethan, who had heard the noise, rushed over. He saw the scene, Sophie embracing his mother, her eyes full of worry but steadfast. He didn't need to ask. He knew she had averted a serious panic attack. After the party ended, Lucas Chen followed Sophie out to the parking lot, where she was waiting for a taxi. He walked behind her, his voice deep. "Little girl, how long do you plan to stay here? I don't think Henry Everett, Ethan's father, will like it. What your father did could cause trouble for both of you." Sophie stopped, but didn't turn around. "I work for Mrs. Catherine. No one else." Lucas took another step. "You don't know you're playing with fire. You are digging up things that the wealthy have buried." Sophie slowly turned back, her eyes steady under the dim streetlights. "I've lived long enough in the dark. Now I'm not afraid of the light anymore, Mr. Chen." Lucas narrowed his eyes, realizing this girl's determination wasn't an act. He smiled faintly and walked away. When Sophie returned to the mansion, Ethan was waiting on the stairs. He stood there, looking tired after a night of socializing, but his eyes revealed clear vigilance. "What did Lucas just say to you?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing worth mentioning," Sophie replied, exhausted. Ethan stepped down one step. "No, I want to know. If anyone bothers you, tell me before things go too far." It was a protective statement, crossing the master-servant boundary. Sophie looked at him for a long time, looking straight into the contradiction in his eyes. The man who had insulted her, yet was also protecting her. "Do you care because of your mother?" Sophie asked softly, her voice almost a whisper. "Or because of me?" Ethan was silent. He looked at her, the nightlight reflecting in his eyes. The answer wasn't spoken, but that silence was the deepest admission. The next morning, Ethan's words about concern still haunted Sophie. She knew it was a small step in their complicated relationship, but she couldn't let personal feelings derail her main objective. She had to act. Mrs. Catherine was in the living room, and she called Sophie over. She signed, "I want to find an old photo of Henry, Ethan's father. It's in the bottom drawer, in his study." Sophie froze. Henry Everett's study was an off-limits area, but this was the perfect opportunity. "Yes, madam," Sophie replied, in sign language, her heart pounding. She entered Henry's study, a vast, meticulously organized space that felt cold. She opened the bottom drawer. Inside, there were not only old files, but also a photograph. Her father, Robert Campbell, shaking hands with Henry Everett. Behind them was a large sign reading, 2009 Energy Project. Sophie flipped the photo over. Faint handwriting on the back, 2009 Energy Project. Key partner. Her hand trembled. Her father wasn't an employee. He was a partner. This completely contradicted the file Ethan had found. She continued searching, finding a small envelope, a copy of a share transfer document, signed Robert Campbell. She examined it carefully. The ink on the signature was shaky, hesitant, as if forced. "Father, did they force you?" She gasped, tears welling up. She quickly hid the document copy in her uniform pocket. The door suddenly opened. Henry Everett stood there. Henry was a more terrifying man than Ethan. Old, cold power, with unconcealed arrogance. He saw Sophie in the forbidden study, his eyes sharp. "What are you doing here?" His voice was deep, full of menace. Sophie tried to stay calm. "Mrs. Catherine asked me to find a photo." Henry stepped in, looking at the open drawer. "A photo? Or are you looking for things that don't belong to you, girl?" Right then, Henry looked closely at Sophie's face, and everything in his eyes suddenly erupted into cold fury. "Campbell," he snarled, the name like a curse. "You are Robert Campbell's daughter." "Unbelievable. The little brat of that embezzler dares to set foot in my house." "He wasn't an embezzler," Sophie retorted, forgetting all her fear. "He was innocent." Henry laughed loudly, a mocking laugh. "Oh, a revenge act with tears. Who do you think you can fool? You came back here for revenge, to slander my family's reputation." Ethan, drawn by the commotion, rushed into the room. He saw his father in a state of extreme anger, while Sophie stood pale, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "Father, what is going on?" Ethan was shocked. "What's going on?" Henry turned to his son, pointing directly at Sophie. "What kind of person have you brought into this house?" "This is the daughter of Robert Campbell, the man who stole our money. She is here to look for files, for revenge." Henry advanced toward Sophie, his voice sharp as a knife. "Get out of here immediately. And never come near the Everett group again. Otherwise, you will suffer 10 times worse consequences than your father." Ethan stared in shock at his father's cruelty. His eyes scanned Sophie's tear-streaked face. Mr. Henry threw a warning look at his son. "A girl like that is only getting close to you to take revenge on our family." The malicious statement left Sophie stunned. She shook her head repeatedly, tears streaming down her cheeks, trying to sign tremblingly to Mrs. Catherine, who had just rushed over. "I am not a bad person. I didn't—" Mrs. Catherine sadly hugged Sophie, reassuring her, though she herself was crying from the tension. Ethan stood between the two sides, his mind reeling. On one side was the father he had revered for so long. On the other was the girl he loved. Ethan's heart twisted seeing Sophie's despair. He turned to his father, trying to stay calm. "Father, I believe Sophie is not what you think." But Mr. Henry dismissed him, glaring. "Don't be naive, Ethan. If you continue seeing her, don't call me father." That sharp declaration cut through the air like a knife, making all the staff nearby hold their breath. Sophie, horrified, shook her head. She didn't want Ethan to lose his family or career because of her. In a panic, she broke free from Mrs. Catherine's embrace and ran away. "Sophie," Ethan called after her, full of pain, intending to follow, but his father's iron hand held his shoulder back. In his ear, Mr. Henry hissed, "You should end this foolish game now, or else." Without letting him finish, Ethan pushed his father's hand away, looking straight into his eyes for the first time with disappointment. "What did you do to her family?" Mr. Henry was momentarily surprised by his son's defiance, but he didn't answer, just coldly turned and walked away. Ethan stood there, watching Sophie's figure rushing out of the gate, his hands clenched so tight that his nails dug into his skin. He knew he had to find the truth immediately. Henry Everett's study was still thick with the smell of old leather and cigar smoke. Every item was precisely arranged, unchanged from years ago, as if time itself had to bow before his power. Ethan stood silently in the room, looking around. The door was still open, where Sophie had just run out with tears in her eyes. The sound of the door hitting the wall seemed to still echo in his head. He didn't chase her. He couldn't. Not when he was the one who caused her such pain. In that moment of silence, her question echoed back, clear and piercing. "Have you ever considered that power can also be wrong?" He knew she wasn't wrong. Ethan slowly walked to his father's desk. Every detail was familiar. The silver Parker pen, the thick file on Solaris, 2009, and a heavy leather chair where Henry Everett used to sit for hours, judging the fate of those under his authority. He sat down, opening the drawer. The Robert Campbell case file was still there, thick, old, the edges of the paper yellowed. He flipped through each page, rereading the lines he had never doubted before. Insufficient evidence. Case closed. Primary responsible party. Robert Campbell. Ethan stopped. His hand gripped the edge of the paper, his eyes slightly trembling. The more he read, the stranger it seemed. The numbers didn't match, some copies were spliced, and his father's signature, Henry's, was on pages that a person with a conscience would never sign. He leaned back in the chair, trying to breathe. What was his father hiding? A soft knock sounded at the door. The person who entered was Thomas, the old butler, holding a brown envelope. "Mr. Ethan," he said, his voice slow. "I think you should meet someone. She used to be the chief accountant for the Solaris project, Mrs. Grace Miller." Ethan looked up, a flash of hope in his eyes. "Is she still in the city?" Thomas nodded. "I just found her address through old records. She lives alone, in the western suburbs, and she once messaged me that if anyone ever asked about the Campbell case again, she would be willing to talk." It was late afternoon when Ethan arrived at Mrs. Grace Miller's small house, an old wooden house hidden in a garden bathed in evening sun. Inside, the scent of black tea lingered. A woman in her 60s, small-framed, with neatly tied grey hair, opened the door. "You are Henry Everett's son," she said, without surprise. "I've been waiting for this day for a long time." Ethan paused slightly, bowing respectfully. "You know why I'm here?" Mrs. Grace smiled softly, her eyes sad. "Because you want to know the truth. And because you have begun to doubt what you once believed. Absolutely." She invited him in and poured tea. On the table was a small wooden box. Inside, an old silver USB drive, along with a note written in shaky handwriting. "I once regretted my silence." Ethan looked up, his voice choked. "How long have you kept this?" "Since 2009, she replied. "Robert Campbell believed there was fraud in the project. He asked me to back up the original data in case the files were altered. I did. But when Henry found out, I stayed silent. I was afraid of losing my job. I was afraid of the truth." Ethan looked at the USB in his hand, his heart heavy. "Are you sure this data still works?" "You should try it," she said softly. "I don't know if it can still save anyone, but it might save the souls of those who died because of the silence." Ethan bowed deeply, his voice deep. "Thank you, Grace. I won't let it be buried again." That night, at the Everett mansion, the study was lit only by the faint light of the desk lamp. Ethan plugged the USB into his laptop, taking a deep breath. The data appeared: transaction tables, vouchers, accounting journals. He began to cross-reference every expenditure of Solaris 2009 with his father's documents. And then he saw it. A large transaction line, noted as imported raw materials. But in Mrs. Grace's original data, that money was transferred through a shell company registered to Lucas Chen. Immediately afterward, an internal order appeared. Assign responsibility to Robert Campbell. Close the file. Signed by Henry Everett. Ethan sat motionless. His fingers slipped from the keyboard. There was no longer any doubt. His father had chosen to conceal his associate's crime to protect the corporation's reputation, sacrificing an innocent man. He whispered softly, his voice choked. "Sophie." Her father told the truth. And I believed the wrong person. It was almost midnight. Rain began to fall. Ethan drove out of the mansion with no destination. He stopped by a deserted street, the yellow light reflecting on the wet pavement. In the car, he opened his contacts, seeing Sophie Campbell's name lit up on the screen. His finger trembled slightly. He pressed call. Once. The signal rang, then cut off. He called again. Twice. No one answered. Ethan leaned back in his seat, covering his eyes with his hand. The sound of the rain tapping steadily on the glass mingled with his heavy breathing. He felt he had never been so lonely. Everything he had once believed in, integrity, reputation, loyalty, turned out to be just layers of ice covering the truth. In the dim light, he saw his mother's photo in his wallet. Mrs. Catherine was smiling gently. The photo faded. Beside it, another photo. A small frame Sophie had left on the desk. She was smiling, her eyes bright as if carrying sunshine. He gently touched the photo, whispering, "I was wrong. And now, I just want to find you, not to apologize with words, but to do the right thing." He reopened the USB, watching the data still gleaming on the laptop screen. Every line of numbers, every voucher was evidence, and also the guilt he had to bear with his father. Outside, the heavy rain continued to fall. In the car, Ethan turned on the recording mode, his deep, hoarse voice echoing in the night. July 14th. I, Ethan Everett, confirm that Robert Campbell was wrongly accused. This is a copy of the original data provided by Chief Accountant Grace Miller. I will make everything public when the time is right. He saved the audio file, leaned back, and closed his eyes. The cold rain seeped through the window, but in his heart, for the first time in many years, a small fire was burning, not of hatred, but of redemption. The next morning, the sun broke through the thin mist. Ethan was still sitting in the car, his eyes deeply shadowed. The phone on the seat remained silent. No texts, no calls. He opened his wallet, looking at Sophie's photo one more time. "If you can hear me, Campbell," he said softly, "believe that this time I will fight for the truth, for you and for your father." He started the car, the morning sunlight shining on the glass, reflecting his tired but determined face. In the distance, the clouds slowly dissipated, revealing a pale blue sky. Silent, but promising something new. The secret had been revealed, and love was still buried under a thin layer of ice, waiting to be warmed by the light of truth. 3 days had passed since Sophie Campbell disappeared. 3 days that felt like 3 years. Ethan Everett tried calling her dozens of times. Each time, the signal rang briefly, and then fell silent. He went to Lucielle, where she used to work. They said she had quit, leaving no forwarding address. He returned to her old rented apartment. The landlord only shook his head. She checked out in the night, without a word. Sophie vanished as if she had never existed. All that remained in him was her trembling voice that day. Have you ever considered that power can also be wrong? Ethan sat in his car all night, the streetlights reflecting on his haggard face. He didn't eat, didn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Sophie leaving the mansion, carrying humiliation, and also the part of humanity he thought had died within him. Finally, as dawn broke, he knew. Finding her was no longer the only goal. He had to do what she believed in, restore justice. The Everett mansion was brightly lit when he returned. The atmosphere was heavy, silent as after a storm. Henry Everett was in his study, his hair grayer, his face cold but weary. Ethan didn't knock. He walked straight in, holding the USB containing the true data of the Solaris project and the printed file. Henry looked up, his voice hoarse. "Where have you been for 3 days?" "The board is furious, and you should forget about that girl." Ethan didn't reply, just placed the laptop on the desk. The screen lit up, displaying the numbers Henry had tried to bury. "Did you know about this?" Ethan asked, his voice choked. He pointed to the transfer line to Lucas Chen's shell company. "The embezzler wasn't Robert Campbell." "It was Lucas, and you knew." Henry looked at the screen for a long time. His face seemed unchanged, but there was a crack in his eyes. "I did it," he said slowly, "to protect the corporation. If that scandal broke out, thousands of people would lose their jobs. Campbell was just an engineer. The reputation of the Everett Group had to be maintained." Ethan gave a faint, bitter laugh. A reputation built on the blood and tears of an innocent man. Henry turned away, his voice becoming firmer, like a self-defense. "I don't regret it. I kept the Everett name from being tarnished. You don't understand, Ethan. Being a leader means accepting loss." Ethan took a step closer, his eyes bright. No longer the meek son. "No, father. Being a leader means taking responsibility. And you ran away. You let an innocent man die in shame, and let his son carry the hatred until today." Henry slammed his hand on the table. "I am your father. What are you going to do? Destroy everything?" Ethan didn't back down, his voice deep but steady. "No, I intend to fix it. Because if you don't dare to look at the truth, then I will do it for you." The air choked. Henry retreated to his chair, his eyes flickering with fear, something Ethan had never seen before in his father's gaze. But he didn't stop. Before leaving the mansion, Ethan went to his mother's room. Mrs. Catherine was sitting by the window, a thin shawl draped around her shoulders, looking out at the wilting rose garden. When she saw her son enter, she merely signed. "Are you ready to do the right thing?" Ethan nodded, his eyes watering. "I'm scared, Mother. I'm afraid everything will collapse." She smiled gently, her hand softly touching his cheek, then signing slowly, each word engraved in his heart. "If you are going to do the right thing, don't look back." The next day, the media simultaneously reported on the Everett Corporation's urgent press conference. The conference room was packed with reporters. Dozens of cameras pointed at the podium where Ethan stood, no longer in an expensive suit, but in a simple white shirt. He held a piece of paper in his hand, his voice deep but clear. "I, Ethan Everett, publicly state that the Solaris case in 2009 was a serious mistake. The convicted man, engineer Robert Campbell, was completely innocent." The entire hall buzzed with murmurs. Ethan looked up, his eyes calm. "I possess the original data kept by Chief Accountant Grace Miller. The lost funds belonged to Mr. Lucas Chen, not Mr. Campbell, and my father, Henry Everett, knew. He paused, taking a deep breath, then opened another sheet of paper, an old letter that Grace had sent along with the USB. In the letter, she wrote, "Sophie Campbell's father once said that reputation cannot be washed clean with the tears of the innocent. I believe that, and today I choose to uphold the honor of Everett by restoring justice to Mr. Campbell." The conference room was silent. A few people bowed their heads. A few camera lenses shook with emotion. That evening, a light rain fell. The news spread across all television channels. Lucas Chen was summoned for investigation. The Everett Group lost nearly 40% of its stock in just 2 days. But Ethan no longer cared. He sat in his car. Outside the window were bright billboards. His phone rang constantly. Shareholders, lawyers, media. He turned them all off. He returned to the mansion late at night. Mrs. Catherine was still waiting for him in the living room, holding the old shawl. When she saw him, she stood up, her eyes teary, her hands trembling as she signed, "You did the right thing. Your father was wrong. I am proud of you." Ethan knelt down, embracing his mother. For the first time in years, he allowed his tears to fall, not from loss, but from liberation. The next morning, Henry Everett still hadn't left his room. The housekeeper said he didn't want breakfast. Ethan walked to the door, gently pushing it open. Inside, the room was dark. Henry sat by the desk, the faint light shining on his face. In front of him was the old photo of him and Robert Campbell shaking hands on the day the Solaris project was signed. On the desk, the morning newspaper was open. Ethan Everett reveals the truth, vindicating engineer Robert Campbell. Henry said nothing. He just sat there, looking at the photo, his eyes deeply sunken. A breeze drifted through, gently blowing the picture onto the floor. He bent down, tremblingly picking it up, and for the first time in his life, Henry Everett looked small. An empire did not collapse because of a storm, but because of the silence of the very man who built it. 6 months later, the city was in spring. Ethan Everett started over, in a small office in the new commercial district. On the glass door, a humble inscription, "Campbell and Everett Consulting." He personally designed the logo, 2 intertwined circles, one for justice, one for second chances. In the afternoon, as he reviewed a file, his secretary knocked. "Sir, there is an applicant for the analytical engineer position. She said she cancelled an overseas job to interview here." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Send her in." The door opened. The woman walked in, a simple white shirt, black hair tied back. That face, though thinner, still carried the light he had missed for half a year. Sophie Campbell. She stopped before the desk, smiling faintly, then raised her hands to sign. "Did I arrive at the right time?" "I need a job." The whole world seemed to stand still. Ethan stood up, his heart pounding, but his voice was deep, warm, and sincere. "Perfect. I've been waiting for you for a long time." Sophie Campbell. Outside the window, sunlight streamed through the glass, shining onto the desk. On it, 2 hot cups of tea steamed, one jasmine, one black, just like the morning years ago that Ethan had forgotten. But Sophie had never forgotten. And this time, he wouldn't let himself forget again. Sophie Campbell looked at Ethan Everett. She didn't move closer, just stood there, maintaining the sign language posture. Her gaze no longer held wariness or humiliation, but deep understanding. She had followed him from afar, aware of the collapse of the Everett empire and his choice. The fact that he founded a company bearing her father's name was the greatest answer to all her doubts. Ethan stepped out from behind his desk. He didn't rush to embrace her. He knew they needed a moment of stillness to confirm the truth. "Where were you?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Somewhere safe," Sophie replied, her voice calm. "I left so you could do what you needed to do, without worrying that I was evidence or pressure." She stepped closer, looking straight into his eyes. "There is one thing I need to say. When I accepted your job offer, I had a motive. I went there to find clues, to prove my father innocent and expose Henry Everett. I took advantage of Mrs. Catherine's vulnerability." Ethan listened, not interrupting. "But," Sophie continued, "what I experienced wasn't according to my plan. I saw Mrs. Catherine's warmth, and I saw your struggle. I began to trust you. I believed in your integrity, even though you are Henry Everett's son." She placed her hand on his chest. "You didn't break that trust. You saved my father's honor. You saved yourself." Ethan gently touched her cheek. "We both have our secrets, Sophie. And we both had reasons to doubt each other. But not anymore." They stood in silence, needing no further declarations of love. They understood each other through sacrifice and through the silent language Ethan once scorned. A few months later, although the new business was still facing many difficulties, Ethan's consulting firm began to establish itself thanks to his reputation for integrity. Sophie worked as an analytical engineer, and she used her education to help the company grow quickly. Their relationship was not rushed, but built on respect. They worked together, ate lunch together, and occasionally Ethan took Sophie to visit Mrs. Catherine. Mrs. Catherine, after the shock of Henry's actions, found peace again. She sold a portion of the mansion grounds and established a small center to teach sign language to deaf children. It was a dream she had cherished for a long time. In the classroom, Sophie was the main instructor. That afternoon, Ethan visited the center. He stood at the glass door, watching Sophie sitting among a circle of children. She was using sign language to teach them a simple song about light and hope. Her face was radiant, completely different from the trembling waitress in the restaurant. Ethan took his hand out of his pocket, raising it. He had learned some basic signs from his mother. He signed slowly, "I am sorry," for all the insults and his family's past. Sophie turned around and saw him. She signed back, gently, "Thank you. For your courage, for clearing my father's name, and for finding me." Ethan walked into the classroom, sitting on the floor next to Sophie and the children. He had never felt like he belonged anywhere more than he did now. Late in the afternoon, the sun filtered through the center's small garden, filled with lavender. Mrs. Catherine sat on a stone bench, watching her son and Sophie helping the children clean up the classroom together. She smiled, signing slowly into the air. Finally, the world has learned how to listen. Ethan and Sophie looked at each other. No words were needed, no power was necessary, only absolute understanding and the peace they had earned together. The brilliant afternoon sun filtered through the lavender trees, casting shadows onto Ethan and Sophie's intertwined hands. That moment of peace closed a journey full of lies, suspicion, and old wounds. They started as opposites, one living in cold power and one pushed into darkness by injustice. But it was the signal in the silence, the language of empathy, that drew them together. Ethan learned that power is not an absolute value. Integrity and loyalty to the truth are the strongest foundations. He was willing to trade an entire empire to restore honor to a stranger, and in the process, he found himself. As for Sophie, she abandoned her initial goal of revenge, learning to trust and accept that not everyone bearing the same surname shares the same guilt. Her courage not only brought justice to her father, but also brought light to a lonely soul like Ethan. Their story is not just about romantic love, but also a profound lesson in communication. Sometimes, what is left unsaid is the most honest truth. Like Mrs. Catherine, We may be deprived of our voices, but we can always find the common language of compassion and truth. After all, they found each other at a new starting point, building a life not based on old fame, but on a foundation of transparency and trust. And you who have accompanied Sophie and Ethan through this journey, what did you see in their story? Have you ever had to struggle between loyalty and truth? Please leave your thoughts in the comments section. The channel host looks forward to receiving your sincere sharing. Always remember that no matter how harsh life is, listening to your inner voice and seeking justice is the most worthwhile thing.